Thank you. Yeah, my name is Dániel Kovács. I'm an art historian, and I'm mostly into post-war architecture, actually. But to this specific occasion, thank you. I thought to bring up one of my earlier research projects. I'm not a design expert, but I put a lot of time and energy to research for a specific object, and I thought it could be really interesting as part of this conference because it's although it kind of grew to be the symbol of the postmodern era, the 70s and the 80s, it is not a postmodern design object, in my opinion, and yet this controversial statement in itself makes it a really interesting subject for such a lecture. I'm not really good in public speaking, so I thought I would give the stage to introduce my lecture to someone who is way better in that than I am, Mr. Morgan Freeman.
Animal life on Earth goes back millions of years, yet most species only use 3 to 5% of its cerebral capacity. But it isn't until we reached human beings at the top of the animal chain that we finally see a species use more of its cerebral capacity. 10% may not seem like much, but it's a lot if you look at all we've done with it.
So Lucy is a really bad movie. It's probably one of the worst by Luc Besson. But there is this little segment in which the professor, played by Morgan Freeman, explains human evolution to the audience. And he depicts it with images and segments from human history, from the invention of fire to dance and religion and Michelangelo and the pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids in Paris and Michelangelo. And at the end, there is this guy who solves the Rubik's Cube. So according to Luc Besson, somewhere at the top of human evolution of what we know right now about humans is a guy solving the Rubik's Cube, which is kind of funny, actually. But I think it's somehow also very accurate. So we all know what the Rubik's Cube is, right? It's just a plastic toy. It's basically a cube. Each side is colored differently, and there is an internal pivotal mechanism which allows the sides to move independently, and thus mixing up the colors. And for the puzzle to be solved, you just have to, every face just have to be turned to have one color. So it's basically a toy. It's like Monopoly or Barbie or Lego or the sticks that we used in the playground to build stuff with. And yet Besson is using this toy to symbolize human evolution, to the big mystery of mankind and thinking and processing, and he's not alone. So through the 40 years of existence of Rubik's Cube, it became one of the most potent symbols of popular culture with a range of possible meanings. I'm going to show you a few examples. In the 1999 movie, Being John Malkovich, it symbolizes an unsolvable mystery here.
For me, I feel like I'm going crazy, Charlie.
I'm sure you're not going crazy.
You don't understand, man. It's like nothing I've ever felt.
Yeah, yada. Were you stoned?
Yes, Jesus. Yes, I was stoned. But that doesn't have anything to do with it. Charlie, someone was talking through my mouth.
You were stoned. Case closed, end of story.
Obviously, that's not the explanation. They couldn't solve the problem. They didn't know what happened, and therefore the cube wasn't solved. In the 2008 movie Wall-E, however, a higher intellect, which actually arrives from space, happens to solve the cube.
Oopsie.
And then it meets with a more simple object, and it obviously doesn't know how it works. This list could go on for really, really, really long. During my research, which started about 5 years ago, I identified 69 full-length films, 16 animation movies, 12 video clips, and numerous other clips and YouTube movies and advertisements which are using the cube as a reference to something. It just appears somewhere as an object or is referenced by, from time to time someone is using it, but in every single case there is something strange in the situation in which it appears. There is something, so it's not just a toy, but to see it when something unusual happens on the stage or when there is a mystery that we are talking about, there is something extraordinary, something that has to do with secrets, or simply there is a higher intellect that they want to point out. How did the Rubik's Cube, while being a simple plastic cube, become this universal symbol? How can we explain what I call the cube paradox? To uncover how the cube became this universal symbol, we have to go back to its origins. The Rubik's Cube was developed by Ernő Rubik, an architect, while working at the Hungarian Academy of Applied Arts, which is today called the Moholy-Nagy University of Art and Design in Budapest. It started as a space experiment. He developed it in a few months, basically, because he wanted to have a tool to experiment with students on surfaces and space, how a flat surface can become something in 3D. After developing the first prototype in 1974, he quickly realized that it's a lot more than just a tool. This is one of the first models, actually, of Rubik's Cube, what you see here. It's from a magazine called Mozgóvilág from 1977. And I think this is a postmodern phase of the Rubik's Cube, actually. As you see, this original resembled a human figure, and you had to put together the human figure again. And then Rubik realized that it's way better and way more understandable to work with colors. And he changed that, and he got a Hungarian patent in 1974, but the actual commercial introduction took 2 more years, so it went to the Hungarian market in 1977. Then it was called Magic Cube. It premiered internationally in Nuremberg in the toy fair in 1978, and then it failed. There was absolutely no answer. But the next year, however, they went back and they managed to make a deal with a Hungarian-born, obviously, with a Hungarian-born toy merchant from America. And in 1980, Rubik signed a name agreement with the American company Ideal Toy. And basically that's where and when Rubik's Cube, as we know it, was born with the name Rubik's Cube. In May 1980, the company, Ideal Toy, presented the toy in a huge gala in the United States, which was hosted by 2 remarkable personalities. One of the hosts was Zsa Gábor. She was an already well-known actress with Hungarian origins. She wasn't that well-known because of his professional career, obviously, but mainly because of the scandals of her private life. I think to 1980, she had probably been married to 5 people. I don't really know. And she was known in American media as an eccentric, strange, independent personality with a distinct origin somewhere in Europe and with a very distinct Hungarian accent. The other host was, strangely, a famous mathematician, so they appeared together in this party, Salomon W. Galamb. Now, Galamb specialized on problems of combinatorial analysis and number theory and communication, and he was not Hungarian. He hosted the party because by 1980, the cube was already very well known in scientific circles. And this started, and that was mainly thanks to Tamás Varga, a Hungarian mathematics professor, because in 1978, when Varga traveled to a scientific conference in Stockholm, Sweden, he decided to bring the cube with himself. And it was there where he met David Singmaster, who was a also a mathematics professor in the South Bank University in London. And Singmaster did not only discover the cube, but he only bought Varga's own piece, because Hungary was the only place at that time where you could buy the cube. He brought it back with himself to London, and he started to experiment with it and publish about it. He became the first person to publish internationally about the cube, and at first in the Observer magazine, and then in Historia Mathematica, which is a scientific journal. He did not only publish about the cube, but he also developed different scientific theories about the cube based on the geometry of the object. And his main and probably most interesting theory was that he started to research the minimal number of movements with which the cube could be solved from any possible combination. Now, you might know that there are, I think, more than 4 trillion combinations of the cube. And Singmaster tried to find out what's the minimal number of movements with which you can solve the cube from anywhere. In 1980, he had absolutely no means to... Oh yeah, the funny thing is that... So this is a mathematical theory, right? And he christened it God's number. So he was researching God's number, this possible number of movements, and in 1980 he had absolutely no means to calculate this number, but he estimated it to be 20. And it took 30 years for the scientific community worldwide to prove, it happened in 2010, that a group of cube enthusiast programmers proved that, yes, the actual number is 20. So you can basically solve no, you can't, obviously, but theoretically you can solve the cube in 20 movements. What we have learned from this is not only that older mathematicians tend to look like each other very much, but also that these people represent 2 special character traits that helped the cube to become what it is now. Zsa Gábor represents coming from specific countries, coming from an external territory, coming from somewhere which was then behind the Iron Curtain, obviously. And Singmaster and Galland represent the scientific aspect, which is hardly understandable for anyone below a certain level of mathematical qualifications like me, but still sounding very interesting, thanks to Singmaster's catchy phrases like God's number. And actually, going back to Zsa Gábor, Hungarians still love to use the Rubik's Cube as a reference to the nation, to the nationality. I just made this photo the other day in Budapest in a bookstore, and obviously Rubik's Cube is being depicted here as a symbol for Hungarianness. These explanations might sound great, but honestly, I doubt that they would be enough to explain how the Rubik's Cube became this pop cultural phenomenon. So they are not enough to explain the cube paradox. There is another pretty obvious point of explanation in this theorem, and this number gives it for us. The cube has been sold in 400 million copies since being introduced to the international market. Obviously, this is an estimate, nobody knows, but this is pretty close. This number is almost a double of households in Europe currently. So it's a huge number, basically. This means that basically everyone, everywhere in the world knows the cube, knows how it looks like, it's able to identify it as a toy, and knows the story behind it. Not necessarily had one once, but they know it as something. On the other hand, Barbie has been sold in millions of copies, and everyone knows how Lego works, and yet Lego doesn't turn up in movies as a symbol of complexity or mystery or something like that. So the number of sold pieces is not an explanation in itself, even if this number And as far as I know, this is true, what I'm telling right now. This number makes the Rubik's Cube the best-selling object ever in the history of mankind. The best-selling unique object, obviously. So there are more chairs and there are more tables, but the unique identifiable object, this is the best-selling object ever. Is this enough? I don't think so. And strangely, there is another aspect which might have helped the cube to achieve this cult status, which is the ultimate failure of the cube. So in the early 1980s, basically everyone in the world was playing with the cube, but in 1982 and 1983, the market crashed, and the cube basically disappeared from the market for more than a decade. The first Rubik's Cube World Championship was held in Budapest in 1982, and it was followed by the second World Championship 21 years later. This meant that in the public conscience, the cube was strongly associated with the 1970s and in the 1980s, and when they started to use it as a pop culture reference, this became one of the main meanings. So it became a very important symbol to identify the 1970s and the 1980s. Several of the pop cultural references actually use the cube as a sign of the time, the 1980s, from the Pixar's movie or the action movie Red 2, or the 2010 science fiction action movie Tron Legacy. And this is a German advertisement that I have just seen on the street the other day. Here it symbolizes the 90s, which is obviously a failure. You see the cube, you don't really see the cube, but it's there next to this person. As I mentioned, I do not consider the cube a postmodern object, because its design is actually based on the principles of what is known as universal design. Universal design is a way of creation that ensures that the object can be understood and used by the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of the age, the size, ability, or disability. This also might be one of the main explanations why it became so well known. To put it simply, even if you have never met with the Rubik's Cube before, the moment you got one in your hand, you know what to do. The design of the object remained, in this sense, time-proof and absolutely timeless. Actually, one time when I was talking to Professor Rubik, he mentioned that the most important aspect of the cube, what he's the most proud of, is the color scheme, because he invented this color scheme in 1975, and he didn't have to change it ever since. So the cube has still the original colors that it was introduced to the market with. On the other hand, however, while it's an object which can be used very simply, the structure of the cube remains hidden. So there is no immediate explanation of its mechanism, and by experience you quickly learn that the task, which is seemingly very simple, is actually pretty hard. So in other words, the cube uses a very simple interface for a complex structure and difficult function. So this makes it really mysterious and helps to associate with high intellect or originality, as in this British series, Doctor Who. It is also often associated with nerdness or geekiness, as in the TV series The Big Bang Theory, or simply depicts or it's used as a symbol for problems that are really, really hard to understand or solve. The frustration which is caused by a cube for most of the people can even lead to associating it with evilness or wickedness, just as in the movie posters here, Death Trap from 1982, and The Cabin in the Woods from 1220. Yes. No, 12. All right, you see the number there. Obviously, there is the Rubik Cube doesn't feature in these movies. They just used it as a reference. They just use it as a symbol for the posters. But you get, so it gives you a sense of what might happen in the movie. And again, the cube can not only help to underline someone's really high intelligence or genuineness, but it might also help to detect the lack of these qualities if it remains unsolved. So like in this sculpture by British artist Alison Jackson, in which George W. Bush is obviously trying to solve the cube, but yes. This character trait I call simplexity. I just figured out that it's not me who invented this word, unfortunately, but so the cube is seemingly a plain but very complex object. It's probably the most important attribute of it, this simplexity. Despite being an object based on principles of universal design, this character trait, so hiding a more important message behind a superficial surface, is the reason of most of its references in popular culture. Like here, in this illustration by W. Scott Forbes. So in this sense, the Rubik's Cube is a unique object which can be used either as a metaphor or an icon or a symbol to something, and also it can appear and be used simply as a toy, as a tool. It's probably not the end of human evolution, but from time to time it can be easily seen as that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. Wow.
A very short question. Did you, in these 90 movies you said, or more than 90 or 60 movies that the
69.
69
Yeah.
that the cube appears, does ever a woman play with it?
Nothing comes to my mind. So mostly men and kids. Yeah, obviously there are...
Male kids, I guess.
Yeah, sorry?
Male kids or girls?
No, also from both genders, yeah.
Or aliens, as we saw. More questions? First, thank you for the presentation. It was so cool. Like all of it. It was like so cool. And the topic is great. But my question is about the architectural background of this. You showed this, you said very quickly that there was an idea to use this for architectural education. Could you tell more how it was, like what exactly was thought and how it was thought to be used for the architectural education and creation of form?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I unfortunately had no chance to talk to Professor Rubik more about this. I have still some people who might explain this to me later. So the seminar that he was teaching was about spatial experiments and the connection between surfaces and 3D or the real world. And he basically wanted to give an opportunity to students to switch between the two, the 3D and 2D. 2D, yes, two dimension. And that's how he came up with this idea. Actually, Andor might know more about this, as I see.
As far as I know, he had a problem with the fact that the students couldn't see the space and they couldn't describe the space through descriptive geometry. And he wanted to have a tool which helped to develop your sense of space and to make the switch in between spatiality and put it into the drawings. And then it turned out, because he thought that it's going to be very easy to remember where is the red part of the cube, which is absolutely difficult because you turn it in your head. And if I may add another thing, that it turned out that it's very good for old ladies with arthritis, because they had to work with their hands, and it was a really good exercise for the hands. Thank you. It was a brilliant lecture.
So,
thank you very much.
All right. So it could be prescribed.
That was not
by
trolling.
doctors.
That was true. That was true. I heard this information.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah, what is your record time? Did you make it under, like, what's
I never solved the Rubik's Cube. I know one person, my brother-in-law can solve it, but he's making a PhD in artificial intelligence, so.
I'm adding a serious question. So just one comment, because I think it's a huge misconception that the cube itself stands for intelligence, because there's a manual. You just have to read the instructions and then you can solve it. So I think there is something about the Rubik's Cube that is special, that it's always presented to be intelligent, to solve the Rubik's Cube, but the only intelligent task you have to do to solve the Rubik's Cube is to read the instructions.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. You can solve the cube, right? Yeah. Yeah, I thought so, because there is this speed solver community. Speed solvers are the guys who can solve the cube really quick. And a returning topic of discussion is that, oh, how stupid are people? I mean, it's so easy to solve the cube if you know the mechanism and if you know the manuals. Yeah, but most people do not know the manuals, actually. So they just see the object and they try it, and then it turns out that, Jesus, it's really difficult to solve, and they don't know that there is by the way, there's a very simple mechanism behind it. It took, for Rubik himself, it took like a month to solve out the first mechanism to solve the cube, so the first mathematic recipe to solve it. So it's not that easy if you don't know that there are manuals.
In the last 10 years, maybe 10 years ago, there was another invention, scientific invention, not invention, exploration from Gábor Domonkos, which resulted also in the object, the Gömböc. Yeah. It's as it turned out, Rubik's Cube has a hidden mathematical background, and the Gömböc came out as a result of a mathematical problems. What do you think, somehow marketing the two objects together can be the Gömböc also, I was just very curious about it.
Absolutely not.
Oh, yeah.
So, the Gömböc is the Gömböc is an object which has one stable position and one unstable position, and that these are the only two ways that you can put it down. So it's more of a geometric experiment, as I understand it. But it's not a toy, so it hasn't got these very complex functional system that is behind the cube. If you give the Gömböc to a kid, she or he plays with it for like a minute and then leaves it there. While if you give the cube to a kid, then it might be interesting for, like, I don't know, days or years even.
Okay, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation.